The morning Colonel Douglas Payne decided to ignore the warning. The sky above Fort Liberty was the color of old iron. Not dark, not dramatic, just the gray that settles over North Carolina in late October when the sun has not committed to rising yet, and the ground still holds the cold from the night before. The kind of morning where nothing looks threatening, where everything looks exactly like it should. That was the problem. Inside the mobile command vehicle, the screens glowed blue-white in the dimness. 6 monitors, each one feeding live data from Oracle, the operational recognition and contextual lethality engine. The Army's newest pride, its most expensive promise, the thing that generals put in briefings with the word revolutionary and procurement officers put in budget reports with the words cost-effective and scalable. The system that the Pentagon had staked 3 years and more money than anyone said out loud on the idea that machines could be taught to see the battlefield the way the best soldiers saw it. 97.2% accuracy. That was the number they used in the presentations. That was the number that made the Joint Chiefs lean forward in their chairs and nod at each other like men who had been waiting a long time for permission to believe in something. Payne sat in the rear of the vehicle with his coffee going cold in his left hand, watching the screens. He was 56 years old and had spent 31 of those years in uniform, and he had the face of a man who had made too many decisions in rooms with no windows, deep-set eyes, a jaw that had forgotten how to relax, a stillness that did not come from peace, but from long practice at controlling what you show, from learning that in a room full of people watching you, the most powerful thing you can do is nothing. On the center monitor, Oracle's thermal overlay painted Ridgeline Alpha in cool blues and greens. The system read every rock, every depression, every pocket of shadow along the 800-meter ridge in real time, processing thermal data at a rate no human analyst could match. It cataloged movement, flagged anomalies, ran probability calculations against its training data, and assigned confidence ratings to each sector with the kind of mechanical certainty that human beings spend careers trying to approximate. In the northwest quadrant, one small indicator pulsed faint yellow before Oracle's classification engine ran its probability calculation and assigned it a label. Environmental confidence, 91%. The young specialist beside Payne leaned slightly toward the screen. His name was Faris, 23 years old, 9 months in the unit, the kind of careful attentiveness that came from not wanting to make a mistake in front of a colonel. He studied the pulsing indicator for a moment. Could be a person, sir. Low thermal signature, heavy gilly maybe. Payne looked at the indicator. He looked at it for 3 full seconds. In the command vehicle, the only sounds were the low hum of the generators and the distant, rhythmic thudding of a helicopter somewhere north of the ridge and Faris's careful breathing. Then Payne reached out and pressed Confirm Environmental. He smiled. Not a large smile, not a cruel one. The small, private smile of a man who knows exactly what is coming and has decided, for reasons that are entirely his own, to let it arrive on its own schedule. Nobody said anything else. Outside, somewhere on that cold ridge, in a patch of earth and shadow that Oracle had already decided was not worth watching, Sergeant Nora Halsey lay completely still and waited. She had been there since 11 o'clock the night before. 6 hours and 47 minutes in the same position, same angle, same 11 contact points between her body and the ground. A spotter's stillness, the kind the body only learns after years of being forced into it, the kind that eventually becomes indistinguishable from patience, because at a certain depth, it is the same thing. She was 29 years old, 5 years in service. The Army had given her many things in those 5 years, and she had taken most of them seriously. The one thing she had not been able to take seriously was the idea that any system, however sophisticated, could replace the quality of attention that a trained human being applied to ground she had already studied for 48 hours. Her M110 semi-automatic sniper system rested on a section of rotted wood she had found at the edge of the eastern tree line when she scouted this position 2 days before the exercise. Not the standard bipod issued with the weapon. Not the regulation setup that appeared in the equipment manual. The rotted wood had two things going for it that metal did not. It did not conduct cold, and it did not conduct heat the way metal does. Oracle's thermal sensors would read a metal bipod differently from its surroundings, a faint but measurable heat sink where the equipment contacted the earth. Old dead wood, especially the compressed pulpy kind that comes from trees long fallen, reads within 2 degrees of packed soil. She knew that because she had spent 3 weeks before this exercise reading every technical document about Oracle that she could legally access. The thermal sensitivity specifications, the classification algorithm confidence thresholds, the training data parameters, the sensor fusion methodology that combined thermal imaging, acoustic analysis, and pattern recognition into the system's overall assessment. She had taken notes in a small green notebook she kept in her jacket's interior chest pocket, and she had thought about those notes the way she thought about a new piece of terrain before a mission. What does this thing see? What does it miss? And most importantly, why does it miss what it misses? The answer, as best she could determine, was this. Oracle had been trained on what it had been shown. It was exceptional at recognizing what it expected to find. It was less reliable at recognizing what nobody had thought to show it. Her ghillie suit was standard issue from the waist down. From the waist up, she had spent 90 minutes 2 days ago weaving in dried grass and brush she had collected from this specific section of Ridgeline Alpha. Not grass from the supply depot, not the standard camouflage material in the unit's equipment stores. Grass from here, from within 50 meters of this position. Dry mountain grass with the specific color and texture and reflective quality of this ridge in late October, the exact environmental signature that Oracle would expect to find at these coordinates. It was not about fooling the system. She was not trying to hide from it. She was trying to speak its language correctly, to present the system with exactly what its training data told it to expect, so that when it looked at her position, it saw a picture that matched its memory of what that ground was supposed to look like. The result was that she had been lying in that ground for nearly 7 hours, and Oracle had looked at her coordinates 4 times during its automated sweep cycle and categorized her as environmental all 4 times. Corporal Jesse Wakefield had arrived at her position at 11:30. He was 26 years old, had been her assigned partner for 6 weeks, and was good at his job in the way that mattered most to her. He observed carefully, spoke rarely, and had learned after approximately 10 days of working together that when she was silent, it meant she was thinking, and silence from him was the correct response. He walked to within 4 feet of her position in the dark before she spoke. "You almost stepped on my barrel, Wakefield." He stopped, looked down at his feet. In the darkness and the dried grass, there was nothing visible except ground. He took 1 careful step backward and stood very still. "Jesus," he said, barely above a whisper. She did not sit up or move to acknowledge him. He found a position 6 feet to her left and settled in without instruction. He did not ask how long she had been there, or why she had chosen this specific spot, or what the plan was. He put up his binoculars and began scanning the ridgeline in a methodical left-to-right pattern. That was why she had requested him as a partner. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The ridge cooled further as midnight passed. The tree line to the east made no sound. The stars above Fort Liberty burned cold and specific, and Nora Halsey lay in the earth and watched the ground 200 meters downslope, where the exercise route would bring General Marsh's observation group in the morning. And she thought about everything except the expected threat axis. She thought about the ground itself. She thought about water drainage patterns and how they shaped depression zones. She thought about where she would lie if she were OPFOR, and she had one chance, and she needed it to be the last thing anyone expected. Her eyes kept returning to a mountain laurel shrub 40 meters north of the main traverse path, a shallow depression, two granite outcroppings framing it like parentheses. She filed it, said nothing, waited. His name was Master Sergeant Bernard Okafor, and he had been dead for 14 months. He was 51 years old when he died. 30 years of service. The kind of soldier who never made the news and never tried to, who did the work with a consistency that became its own form of authority. He had been Nora's primary instructor during her advanced sniper qualification at Fort Benning. And of all the things she had been taught by all the people who had tried to teach her, his lessons had settled deepest. She did not think about him directly. The mind learns to carry certain losses the way the body learns to carry a heavy ruck over long distance. You stop noticing the weight itself, and you start noticing only when the weight shifts unexpectedly. When Wakefield broke the silence just past 2 in the morning, the weight shifted. Okafor's old unit is running up for today, he said. Not pointed, just a piece of information. The kind of thing you say when the hours are long and the silence needs an occasional breath of something. Nora's right hand tightened on the M110's stock. A small movement, involuntary, half a second, and then released. Yeah, she said. Wakefield didn't follow up. He understood something about the word Okafor that most people in the unit had learned not to test. But the name was in the air now, and the air carried it. And for a moment, the cold of the ridge was less present than a room at Fort Benning 3 years ago. It was the night after a long evaluation exercise, and she was sitting in the debrief, carrying the exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from sustained concentration, from holding every variable still in your mind for hours without letting any one of them slip. Okafor was across the table from her. Large man. The kind of large that reads as stillness rather than bulk. Grey beginning at his temples. Eyes that had the quality of someone who had spent most of her life looking at things far away and had learned to be patient about what they revealed. He put her shot record on the table between them. You hit the target, he said. 14 for 14. You were looking at the target. She waited. A real sniper looks at everything else. Everything the target thinks is safe. That sounds backwards. That's the only way forward. She had thought at the time that he was being philosophical in the way that experienced soldiers sometimes were, using abstraction to dress up something simple. It took her 2 more years to understand that he meant it with complete literalness, that the skill of her trade was not marksmanship. The marksmanship was the delivery system. The skill was attention, comprehensive, structured, patient attention to everything that was not the thing everyone else was watching. Everything the target assumed was already cleared, already safe, already decided. She came back to the ridge. The cold, the M110 on its wood. The eastern horizon had begun to thin at its edges. Not light yet. The suggestion of light coming, the darkness becoming less absolute. She looked at the mountain laurel in the depression. In the near dark, at this distance, she could not see it clearly, but she had measured its position at dusk through the scope, and she knew where it was, and she had been watching the general area for 7 hours, and she was certain of 2 things. The branch movement was not random. The shadow beneath it was wrong. Oracle declared Ridgeline Alpha clear at 0515. The message came through the exercise network with the system's characteristic precision. All sectors green, confidence levels in the high 90s across all quadrants, recommended route confirmed, proceed on schedule. The text read like something written by a machine that had no interest in being wrong and had not been given the vocabulary for uncertainty. Brigadier General Conrad Marsh would lead the observer group from the southern access road, traverse the eastern slope of the ridge, and reach the observation platform at 0630, standard evaluation walk, a demonstration of what the future of battlefield awareness looked like when you trusted the system to do what the system had been built to do. Nora heard the all clear in her earpiece and said nothing. She was looking at the bush, specifically at a mountain laurel shrub, approximately 40 meters north of the main traverse path, in the shallow depression between the two granite outcroppings she had noted during the night. The bush was about 1.5 meters tall, and in the growing pre-dawn light, it looked like every other mountain laurel on the ridge. At 0520, it looked exactly, precisely, unremarkably like what it was supposed to look like, except for 3 things. The first, the bush was moving. Not much. A slight tremor in the upper branches, rhythmic, consistent, occurring at a rate of approximately 12 to 15 times per minute. The wind at that moment was blowing southwest at 6 miles per hour. She could feel it against the left side of her face, and she could see it in the grass on the slope below, and she could read its direction and speed with the accuracy of someone who had spent years learning to treat wind as a variable with a personality. The bush's movement was not corresponding to that wind. The tremor was from within. More regular than wind makes things. More deliberate. The small, unavoidable physical consequence of a living body breathing in a confined space and trying not to. The second, the shadow. Shadows at that hour, in that quality of light, have a consistent texture across a given surface. The granular darkness is even throughout because the light source is even. The shadow beneath the mountain laurel had a different density in one specific section, roughly 40 centimeters wide and 80 centimeters long, running east to west under the southern edge of the shrub. That portion of shadow was darker, denser, not because of the foliage above it, because something beneath the bush was absorbing light differently from the surrounding soil. The third was the thing no sensor in Oracle's array was calibrated to detect. At the base of the depression, where the soil met the lowest edge of the granite outcropping on the north side, there was a thin, irregular line where the frost had not formed. The surrounding ground was uniformly dusted with the fine crystalline frost that comes on clear, cold nights when the temperature drops through 30 degrees before dawn. But in one specific line, no wider than 2 centimeters, no longer than 20, the frost was absent. The soil there was fractionally warmer, not from a heat source above ground, from warmth transferring upward through the soil from a body that had lain on that ground long enough, motionless enough, for its thermal signature to migrate downward and then radiate back up at the edges. Oracle read thermal signatures above ground level and mapped them against its environmental baseline. It did not account for conductive thermal migration through packed soil, because no one had thought to include that in its training parameters. She had thought of it at 2:15 in the morning, lying in her own position on the ridge, when she noticed that the ground beneath her own chest was slightly warmer than it had been when she first lay down. She keyed her radio. Halsey to TOC. Possible concealed position, northwest quadrant, grid 447. Request hold on General Marsh's movement. The response came back in 15 seconds. The duty officer's voice was professional and carrying a faint undertone of the tedium that comes with early morning radio watch. Copy, Halsey. Oracle shows clear. Continue mission. Wakefield had been listening. He put up his binoculars toward the depression. He didn't say anything yet. He was looking. Look at the shadow under the bush, she said. 3 o'clock from center. Tell me if it moves with the wind. He was quiet for 10 seconds. 11, 12. It doesn't, he said, low and careful. She keyed the radio again. Halsey to TOC. Second request, hold on movement. Northwest quadrant, depression, mountain laurel. Grid 447. I am observing non-wind corresponding branch movement and an anomalous ground shadow pattern. There is also a frost-absent line at the base of the north granite face, consistent with thermal transfer from a prone human body. Someone is in that position. Request immediate hold. This time the response came faster, a different voice, harder and less patient. Sergeant Halsey, this is Captain Roy Delaney. Oracle has assessed that grid at 91% environmental confidence. Your request is denied. We are proceeding on schedule. Stand down. Wakefield looked at her across the 6 feet between their positions. She said nothing. She kept the scope on the depression and counted branch tremors and watched the shadow and calculated distance and time. General Marsh's group would appear at the southern access road in approximately 40 minutes. Moving at a walking pace along the designated route, they would reach the point where the traverse path came closest to the depression in approximately 55 minutes from now. 55 minutes. She moved nothing except her eyes. In the mobile command vehicle, Colonel Payne received notification that Sergeant Halsey had submitted 2 unauthorized hold requests, both denied. He read the details on his secondary screen. The frost line observation, the shadow analysis, the branch timing correlation. He read them with the unhurried attention of someone who has been given information he was expecting. He sat with it for a moment longer than the moment required. Then he looked at his watch. 0538. Then he looked at the Oracle display, which showed ridgeline alpha green and clear and completely confident. Then he looked out the narrow forward window of the vehicle at the ridge itself, the real ridge, the dark physical fact of it against the lightening sky. He did not call the TOC. He did not issue an additional order. He did not instruct anyone to look more carefully at grid 447. He set his cold coffee down on the console beside him. The small private smile from before was completely gone now. In its place was something more complicated, harder to read, the expression of a man watching pieces move on a board that has more dimensions than the other players have been told about. The expression of someone who has made his wager and is now waiting, with the discipline of long experience, for the outcome that he has calculated but cannot fully control. He said to the air inside the vehicle, "Let it run." Specialist Farris, who was looking at his own screen, heard the words and did not know what to do with them, and so did nothing, which was the correct response. Marsh's group appeared at the Southern Access Road at 0550. 9 people. The general, 2 aides, 3 members of the evaluation team from Washington, 2 security personnel, and a civilian contractor from the company that built Oracle, who was present to observe the system's real-world performance and collect data for the next round of capability briefings. They moved in a loose group, not a tactical formation. This was not a combat exercise for them. It was a demonstration of a future that had already been decided on. They were here to watch it work. Nora watched them through the scope. She did not watch Marsh. She watched the mountain laurel. At 600 meters through a loopholed Mark 5 HD in the growing pre-dawn light, the scope brought the world close enough that she could read the coarse grain of the granite outcroppings flanking the depression. close enough to see individual branch tips, close enough to see that in the past 10 minutes, the shadow beneath the southern edge of the bush had extended 3 centimeters to the east, as if whatever was beneath it had shifted weight in preparation for something. 280 meters. The group moved at walking pace, unhurried. She keyed the radio one final time. She kept her voice completely level. TOC Halsey, final advisory, observed weight shift in target position. Group is 240 meters and closing. I am requesting immediate halt of general's movement. Captain Delaney's voice came back hard and immediate. Sergeant Halsey, stand down. Do not transmit again. If you fire your weapon or take any unauthorized action, you will be removed from this exercise and face formal disciplinary review. That is a direct order. Acknowledge. She released the radio key without acknowledging. 200 meters. She thought about Okafor's people running op for today. She thought about Dennis Kerr, whose name Wakefield had mentioned, whom she had never met, but who had trained under the same hands and the same philosophy. She thought about what it meant that Okafor's unit was here, on this ridge, on this day. She thought about 14 months, about a file closed in 48 hours, about an equipment failure that nobody investigated, and a man who had given 30 years to a flag and had been folded away like a report nobody wanted to have written. 160 meters. She had been asked not to see what she could see. She had been told by a system, and by the people who trusted that system, that the ground in front of her was clear and safe and already decided. She exhaled, slowly, completely. Her finger rested on the trigger. She did not aim at the bush. She aimed at the granite outcropping 2 meters north of it, specifically at a point on the rock's lower face, where the surface angle would cause the round to deflect downward into the soil rather than ricochet unpredictably outward. The sound would come from the north. Anyone lying in that depression, anyone trained by the same man who had trained her, would understand exactly what that sound meant. Not a threat, a signal, a message sent in the only language the moment had left available. You have been seen. The next decision is yours. The M110 fired once. The sound crossed ridgeline Alpha like a hand brought flat against stone. Clean. Definitive. In the depression, the mountain laurel came apart in motion, as a figure in a ghillie suit rose from the earth with the startling speed of something that has been waiting a long time, and the security personnel around Marsh had weapons up before the echo finished, and Sergeant First Class Dennis Kerr stood with both hands raised against the grey October sky, his face carrying the composed expression of a professional soldier who has been beaten cleanly and knows it. Everything stopped. The group, the security detail, the civilian contractor who had dropped behind one of the aides with a speed that suggested he had not always worked in an office. The aides. All of it. The radio in Nora's ear erupted with voices she stopped listening to. She was watching Wakefield. He was looking at her across the 6 feet between their positions with an expression she recognized. Not amazement exactly, but the quieter thing beneath it. The look of someone watching another person do something that cannot be fully explained and deciding in real time what to do with that. He was 26 years old, and this was not the kind of moment his training had prepared him for explicitly. You can be told what right looks like in the classroom. It is different when right is also disobedient. He did not step away from her. She had known, when she pulled the trigger, that she was trading her standing in this exercise for one outcome. She had decided the trade was worth making. What she had not decided was whether Wakefield would make the same trade by association. That had been his choice to make. He had made it. She appreciated that more than she would ever say out loud. "You know him?" Wakefield asked when she lowered the scope. Kerr was being secured by the exercise controllers below, moving cooperatively, hands still raised, the body language of a professional giving nothing away in surrender except the surrender itself. "I know who trained him," Nora said. She began to break down the M110 in the sequence that Okafor had made her practice until it was reflexive. Barrel first, handled clean, scope off and cased, stock folded. Each component wrapped and placed in the hard case with the care that people give to things they intend to use again. Not because she had time to be methodical. The military police vehicle she could see moving up the access road below would be at the base of the slope in less than 4 minutes. She was methodical because the hands know what they have been taught, and teaching holds you when everything else is in motion. She thought about 14 months, about Okafor's file, about the way the army had filed a good man away and moved forward without looking back. She thought about the sound of one shot crossing a ridge at dawn. The MPs parked at the base of the slope, 2 of them in standard dress, approaching with the careful professional efficiency of people doing an unpleasant task correctly. And then a third figure stepped out of the vehicle behind them. Not an MP, a woman, mid-40s, chief warrant officer insignia on the collar, standard issue jacket, carrying nothing, no clipboard, no radio, nothing that announced a particular purpose. She looked up the slope at where Nora stood in the growing light with the M110 case at her feet and the dried ridge grass still woven into her suit. Her face was neutral in the careful, deliberate way of someone who has trained themselves to give nothing away before they know what they are giving it to. She said something to the MPs, who stopped and waited at the vehicle. Then she walked up the slope alone. When she reached Nora's position, she stopped. She looked at the rotted wood on the ground, at the compressed grass, where Nora had lain for nearly 7 hours, at the M110 case, at the pattern of local grass woven into the suit. She assembled the picture with the systematic attention of a person conducting an evaluation. Then she looked directly at Nora. "Sergeant Halsey." "Mom." The woman paused. Around them, the ridge was filling with the controlled urgency of an exercise shutting down. Vehicles, radios, human movement with purpose. "My name is Pruitt. Chief Warrant Officer Sandra Pruitt. Program Oversight." She reached into the interior pocket of her jacket and produced a laminated facility badge that carried access clearances Nora did not recognize from any standard program she had been briefed on. Nora said nothing. Pruitt looked out over the ridge for a moment. Then, in a voice low enough to belong to no one else, "Okafor sent me." The words did not land the way most words landed. They landed the way a single shot lands on a quiet morning, with perfect clarity and the absolute irreversibility of something that has already happened. Bernard Okafor had been dead for 14 months. Nora looked at the woman and understood, in the way that soldiers understand things they have not been briefed on, that the morning had not ended with a shot, it had begun with one. That what had happened on Ridgeline Alpha was not the event, it was the opening. That Bernard Okafor, who had taught her to look at everything the target assumed was already safe, had apparently spent some portion of his last months looking at exactly that, and planning for this. The MPs were waiting at the vehicle below. The mountain laurel stood empty in the rising light, its branches moving now with the actual wind. Nora picked up the M110 case. "Let's go," she said. She walked down the slope and did not look back, because she had already seen everything she needed to see, and the rest was ahead of her. The interrogation room at Fort Liberty's security annex was 8 feet wide and 11 feet long, and had been painted the shade of institutional beige that the Army had used in rooms like this for decades, a color chosen not because anyone liked it, but because it was the color of nothing, the color of a space that refused to take sides. There was a table, 2 chairs, a light fixture overhead that gave the room a brightness that had no warmth in it. On the wall opposite the door, a mirror that nobody pretended was just a mirror. Nora sat in the chair closest to the wall and put the M110 case on the floor beside her left boot and folded her hands on the table and waited. She was good at waiting. She had spent the better part of the last 12 hours doing it, first on the ridge, then in the back of an MP vehicle with her hands in her lap and the Fort Liberty tree line moving past the window, and now here. The room was empty, except for her, for 12 minutes. She knew because she counted. Not because she was anxious, because counting was what you did when you were in a room with nothing to observe. You measured what you had. Then the door opened, and CW3 Sandra Pruitt walked in, alone, without the MPs, and closed the door behind her with the deliberate quietness of someone who did not want it to be heard from outside. She carried nothing except a single photograph, face down, held loosely at her side. She sat across from Nora. She put the photograph on the table between them, still face down. She did not turn it over. "I need to know what you saw on that ridge," Pruitt said. "Not the report version, what you actually saw." "I saw 3 things Oracle missed," Nora said. "I reported them twice. I was denied twice. I fired a warning shot when the group reached critical proximity. Sergeant First Class Dennis Kerr was extracted from the position. General Marsh was never in contact with the threat. End of sequence." "That is the report version." Nora looked at her. Pruitt turned the photograph over. It was a page of text, partially redacted. Black bars through 2 of the 3 paragraphs, heavy and deliberate. The 3rd paragraph was intact. In the lower right corner, barely visible through the redaction on the 2nd bar, 2 letters that might have been initials. Nora looked at the visible paragraph. Read it again. The text was clinical, the way that government documents are clinical. The language of assessment stripped of anything that could be called feeling. But the words were clear enough. Subject demonstrates anomalous resistance to Oracle Override Protocol. Pattern of independent threat assessment inconsistent with system-integrated operational model. Recommend continued observation. Nora looked up from the page. "What is this?" "It is the reason you are in this room," Pruitt said, "and it is the reason Bernard Okafor died." The weight shifted, the way it always did when Okafor's name entered a space where it had not been expected. Nora kept her face still. "He died in a training accident. Equipment failure. He died 3 weeks after submitting a formal internal complaint about Oracle's classification accuracy in live fire conditions." Pruitt let that land. Let the room hold it for a moment. The complaint was filed, reviewed internally, closed in 48 hours. Cause: insufficient evidence. 3 weeks after that, his equipment failed. Nora said nothing for a long time. Outside the room, somewhere in the corridor, boots moved past at a measured pace and faded. "Why are you telling me this?" Nora asked. "Because he asked me to," Pruitt said. "Not today. He asked me 14 months ago, 3 days before the accident. He gave me a set of instructions, and he told me to follow them only if something happened to him, and only if, within the following 2 years, someone else on this post demonstrated the same pattern he had demonstrated." She paused. "The same anomalous resistance to what Oracle tells them to see." Nora understood then what the photograph was. Not a document that Pruitt had found. A document that Okafor had collected. A piece of what he had been building, quietly, methodically, the way a man builds anything when he understands that what he is building may outlive him. "How many people know about this?" Nora asked. "Right now, you and me." Nora looked at the photograph, at the redacted paragraphs, at the 2 visible initials in the corner of the 2nd bar. not quite hidden, an accident of imprecise redaction. The letters were C and M. She knew two people at Fort Liberty with those initials. One of them was Conrad Marsh. She did not say this out loud. Pruitt reached across the table and turned the photograph face down again, as if the act of concealment were itself a kind of protection. Then she reached into the interior pocket of her jacket and set a small, black USB drive on the table beside the photograph. Okafor spent 6 months collecting this, she said. He never got to use it. Nora looked at the drive, did not touch it. What's on it? Log data from 11 Oracle field exercises over 18 months, every one of them. And Pruitt's voice stayed level and quiet, the voice of someone delivering a verdict they have already made peace with. In each exercise, at least one threat was identified by a human spotter before Oracle flagged it. In each case, Oracle's eventual classification was logged as an independent detection. The human input was stripped from the record before the exercise report was finalized. She stopped, let the room absorb it. Oracle didn't detect those threats. It confirmed what soldiers had already found. Then it took credit. The fluorescent light above them hummed at a frequency that only became audible in silence. 97.2% accuracy. Nora understood now what that number actually was. Not a measure of what the system could do, a measure of what it had been fed. The system had learned to pattern match against human perception, then report that perception as its own. And someone had known. Someone had designed the reporting structure to make the numbers look like what the presentation required them to look like. Who built the reporting structure? She said. Pruitt did not answer immediately. She looked at the table for a moment, and in that moment, she looked older than she had at the top of the ridge slope, the kind of older that comes from carrying information alone for too long. That is the part, she said, where it gets complicated. Wakefield was in a separate room down the corridor. He did not know this, but he could hear things through the wall if he pressed his ear against it, which he was not doing because there was a camera in the upper corner of his room, and he was 26 years old and still young enough to believe that looking calm was different from being calm. The officer who had come to question him was a captain whose name Wakefield had heard but not caught, a square-faced man with the efficient manner of someone used to getting answers and genuinely surprised when he didn't. He had a legal pad and a pen, and he had started by asking straightforward questions, and then, gradually, had started asking questions that were no longer straightforward. Did Sergeant Halsey indicate to you prior to firing that she intended to discharge her weapon, regardless of command authorization? No, Wakefield said. She didn't. You're certain? She didn't tell me because she was still hoping command would authorize the hold. She fired when it was clear they wouldn't, and the general was approaching critical range. The captain made a note. That's not consistent with your signed report. Wakefield stopped. The captain set a sheet of paper on the table in front of him. Wakefield's name at the top. His unit information. A narrative account of the events on Ridgeline Alpha. His signature at the bottom. He read it. The words were his, in the way that a house is still a house after someone has moved the furniture. The facts were present, but the sequence had been rearranged, and 2 sentences had been added that he had not written, and 1 paragraph had been removed that he had, and the result was a document that described not what had happened, but what would have been administratively convenient for someone if it had happened. He read it twice, to be certain he was not wrong. He was not wrong. Someone had altered his report. Someone with access to the exercise documentation system. Someone who had done it cleanly enough that the signature at the bottom was still his, which meant they had not created a new document but had edited the original, which required a level of system access that was not available to most people in this building. The captain was watching him. Wakefield looked up from the paper. "This isn't what I wrote," he said. "Corporal, your signature is at the bottom of that page. My signature is at the bottom of a different version of that page." He kept his voice even, not confrontational, precise. "I am telling you that the text I am reading now is not the text I submitted. 2 sentences in the 3rd paragraph were not written by me. The 4th paragraph has been removed entirely." The captain's pen was still. He was looking at Wakefield with an expression that had shifted from its original efficient certainty into something less settled. "That's a significant allegation," he said. "That's an accurate description," Wakefield said. He thought about Nora, about standing on the ridge and watching her break down the M110 with her hands moving in the practiced sequence while the military police vehicle came up the slope, about the choice he had made when she fired, and when the moment of choosing whose side you were on arrived without announcement, the way those moments always do. He had made his choice on the ridge. He saw no reason to unmake it in this room. "I want to see the original submission timestamp for that document," he said, "and I want to see the edit log." The captain looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up the legal pad and stood and left the room without a word. Wakefield sat in the silence and understood that he had just done something that could not be undone, and that the only question now was whether he had done it correctly. In his office on the far side of the building, Colonel Douglas Payne received a notification that CW3 Pruitt had been in the interrogation room with Sergeant Halsey for 22 minutes with no monitoring audio. He already knew. He had been watching on the security camera feed since the moment Pruitt walked up that slope alone. He pushed back from his desk and walked to the window. His office looked out over the Eastern Parade Ground, which was empty at this hour, except for 2 maintenance workers moving in the distance and a flag snapping in the wind that had picked up since dawn. The ridge was not visible from here. He had watched the whole sequence on camera, including the shot, including Kerr coming up from the depression with his hands raised, including the way Halsey had stood in the light afterward, not triumphant, not relieved, simply present, already calculating what came next. Okafor had described her to him once, 18 months ago, in a conversation that had not been easy. He had said, "She does not look at the target. She looks at everything the target trusts." At the time, Payne had taken that as a technical description of a marksmanship philosophy. He understood now that Okafor had been describing something larger. He had made a calculation when he pressed that confirm environmental button this morning. He had made it carefully, with the same precision he applied to every significant decision, which was to say, he had run it through every dimension he could identify and had accepted the risk in each one. The calculation had not included Nora Halsey doing precisely what she had done. It had included her noticing. It had not included her noticing and acting with that combination of restraint and audacity, a single warning shot that exposed the position without creating a casualty, without breaking the law of armed conflict, without giving him anything that could be used against her except the insubordination itself. Okafor had taught her that too, he suspected. He turned away from the window. There was a decision in front of him now. He had known for some time that a decision like this was coming. He had made choices in the past year and a half that had been meant to manage the arrival of this moment, to shape the conditions around it, to ensure that when it arrived in a form he could direct rather than one that directed him. Some of those choices had been defensible. Some of them he would not want to explain in a room with a court reporter present. He sat back down at his desk. He picked up his phone and made a call that he had been thinking about making for 6 months. It rang 4 times. Then a voice he knew answered. Payne said, "It's time to have the conversation we've been avoiding." A pause, then, I know. Come to my office, not tonight. Now. The USB drive sat on the table between them, and Nora had not yet touched it. She was thinking about the initials, C and M. Conrad Marsh, the general whose life she had, by any reasonable measure, protected this morning. The man who was at this moment being debriefed somewhere in this building, receiving the narrative of the exercise from the perspective of someone who had been protected, who had been the subject of a system working as intended. Except the system had not worked as intended. The system had failed. And the man with those initials, if she was reading this correctly, had either known about the failure or had shaped the conditions that made the failure possible, or both. She thought about the way Marsh had moved on the ridge, the loose group, the ease of it, the civilian contractor from the Oracle company walking alongside him like a man at a demonstration. A demonstration of what, exactly? Of a system that worked, of a future that was already decided, of 97.2% accuracy under real field conditions, witnessed by evaluation team members from Washington who would go back to Washington and write reports that would be used to justify the next appropriation. He was going to use today's exercise as evidence, Nora said. Pruitt looked at her. Marsh. He was going to let Oracle run. Pull the data, take the numbers to the evaluation team. If the OPFOR penetration worked, and Oracle caught it, perfect. If Oracle missed it, the after-action report would be written the same way 11 previous reports were written. She thought through the sequence. Either outcome serves the demonstration. The system looks like it works because the documentation is built to say it works. Pruitt was quiet. Okafor worked that out before I did. It took him 4 months of looking at the log data. And when he filed the complaint, reviewed by an internal board, findings reviewed by the program director, closed in 48 hours. Who is the program director? Pruitt looked at the table. That is one of the questions Okafor's file is intended to answer. Nora picked up the USB drive. Small, lighter than it should have been for what it contained. She turned it over once and then closed her hand around it. He knew this was going to happen to him, she said. Not a question. He prepared for the possibility. He told me there was a difference. Pruitt's voice was careful. He said, I am not certain this will happen. I am certain it is the kind of thing that could happen. And if it does, I need someone on the other side of it who can finish the work. Nora looked at the closed door. Through it, the sounds of the building. Boots, distant voices. The institutional movement of a facility processing an unexpected event. There is a secondary data server, she said. Building B3. The backup archive for drone footage from exercises. Separate from the main network. Pruitt looked at her sharply. How do you know about that? I read the facility layout documents before this exercise. I read everything. Nora's hand tightened around the drive. If the drone footage from this morning is in the main system, it will be edited the same way the exercise reports are edited. But if we can get to the physical backup in B3 before the next automated sync cycle, the raw footage is still there. When is the sync cycle? Nora thought, automated sync runs every 6 hours from the exercise completion timestamp. They called the exercise at 0658. That puts the sync at 12:58. She looked at the clock on the wall. We have 19 minutes. Pruitt looked at the door, at the mirror, at the clock. There are 2 MPs in the corridor, she said. I know. If we leave this room without authorization, we are both in violation of the administrative hold. Yes, Pruitt studied her. The quality of that study was the quality of someone who has spent a long time waiting for the person who was supposed to carry something forward, and is now looking at the person who is actually going to do it and making a final assessment of whether they are the right one. Whatever she found in Nora's face was apparently sufficient. She stood. The corridor has a camera. The camera covers the door and the MP station, but not the stretch between them and the east stairwell. 42 feet, Nora said. I mapped it. Pruitt looked at her with an expression that in a different moment might have been something close to a smile. Of course you did. Nora picked up the M110 case from the floor beside her boot. Then she put it back down. The case would be visible, would telegraph movement, would be exactly the kind of thing that made people pay attention. She opened it, removed the scope from its compartment, and put the scope in her jacket's cargo pocket, where its outline was less defined. Everything else stayed in the case. She stood. The room was 8 feet by 11 feet. The table, 2 chairs. The light overhead with its cold brightness. 14 months. A file closed in 48 hours. A man who had spent 30 years understanding what machines could not see, folded away like a piece of administrative inconvenience. Nora walked to the door and opened it. The corridor was institutional green and smelled of cleaning fluid and recycled air. The 2 MPs were at their station 8 feet to the left. One of them looked up when the door opened. Nora did not look at him. She turned right, walking at a pace that was not slow and not fast. The pace of someone with a purpose that was already authorized. The pace that Okafor had taught her in a different context and different terrain. Move at the speed of belonging. Pruitt came out behind her, pulled the door mostly closed, turned right without hesitation. 42 feet to the east stairwell. One of the MPs said something. Nora did not catch the words. She did not stop. She heard the scrape of a chair being pushed back. Pruitt said, without turning around, in the clear, confident voice of a warrant officer who has been in this building longer than most of the people in it. We're needed in oversight. I'll have her back in 20. A pause. The scrape of the chair again, settling. They reached the stairwell door. Nora pushed it open, and they went through. Building B3 was 340 meters from the security annex across the main motor pool lot and along the South Perimeter Road. In daylight, with the exercise shutdown still filling the post with unusual activity, 2 people walking with purpose were not 2 people trying not to be seen. They were 2 people going somewhere. Nora walked on Pruitt's left, slightly back, at the distance that suggested junior in rank but engaged in conversation. They were not in conversation, but from a distance it would not be obvious. She kept her hands easy at her sides and her eyes on the building ahead, and she thought about the sync cycle, and 19 minutes becoming 16 and then 14, and she did not think about what happened if they were wrong or slow, or if someone had already started the manual override. She thought about Okafor walking into a building somewhere on some post 14 months ago with the knowledge that the thing he had spent 6 months building was the most important thing he had left behind, knowing what the file contained, knowing what it meant, knowing that the system he had served for 30 years had in some particular and specific way decided that he was a problem to be managed rather than a soldier to be heard. She thought about what it cost a man to keep moving forward when he understood that. B3 was a low concrete structure, utilitarian, the kind of building that existed on military posts without being noticed because its function was mechanical rather than human. Nora had been inside it once, 7 months ago, during a facility orientation that most people in her cohort had treated as a formality. She had taken notes. The door required a keycard. Pruitt produced hers from the interior pocket of her jacket. The program oversight clearance she carried included access to all exercise-related data infrastructure on post, a provision that had been written into her assignment brief 18 months ago at Okafor's request, though nobody had thought to question the specificity of it at the time. She swiped without breaking stride, and the door clicked open. Inside, fluorescent lights on motion sensors that flickered on as they entered. server racks on 3 walls, black and blinking, the quiet mechanical pulse of storage doing its work. At the far end, a workstation with a monitor showing a screensaver. And at that workstation, already seated, already turned toward them as if he had heard them coming, a man. He was late 30s, technical branch insignia, the face of someone who had not slept well and to whom this was not new. He had a half-empty coffee cup and both hands flat on the desk in front of the keyboard, a posture that read as deliberate, as someone who wanted his hands to be visible. Nora stopped. The man looked at her. His eyes moved to the cargo pocket, where the scope made a slight outline, then back to her face. "I know who you are," he said. His voice was quiet and carried the steadiness of someone who has made a decision and is past the anxiety of making it. "Sergeant Halsey." She said nothing. "My name is Desson, Captain Roy Desson. I am the Facility Systems Officer for this annex." He paused. "I have been sitting in front of this workstation for the past 21 minutes, preventing the early execution of the 6-hour sync cycle." The room was very quiet. The servers hummed. "Someone initiated a manual sync request at 0712, he said, 14 minutes after the exercise was called at 0658. Someone who had the authorization code to request an early sync, which is not a long list of people." He picked up the coffee cup, looked at it, put it down without drinking. "I have administrator override for this system. I used it. The request is suspended." Pruitt spoke carefully. "How long have you known about this?" Desson looked at the server racks and then back at them. "I knew Okafor," he said. "Not well, but enough." He picked up a folded piece of paper from beside the keyboard, held it toward Nora. She took it. It was a handwritten note. The handwriting was compact and precise. She recognized it the way you recognize a voice before you consciously place it, a recognition that lives in the body before the mind catches up. She had seen Okafor's handwriting on her training evaluations, on the notes he had left on her shot records. The note said 2 things. The first was a file name. The second was a password. The file name was Ghost Zero. Nora stood in the server room of Building B3 at Fort Liberty, North Carolina, with Bernard Okafor's handwriting in her hand, and understood that this was the moment he had built toward. Not the shot this morning. This, the file, the room, the person standing in it. She had been the last piece of the plan. She just had not known it. "He chose you," Desson said. He was watching her face. He said if the day came, it would be someone with an M110 and a homemade ghillie suit and more patience than sense. A pause that might have been something close to affection. "He said you would be too stubborn to look at the target." Nora looked at the note in her hand. Then she looked at Pruitt. "Plug in the drive," she said. Pruitt moved to the workstation. The USB drive went in. Desson moved aside to give her the keyboard. The folder opened. Ghost Zero, 18 months of log data, 11 exercises. The raw telemetry records that showed, in the precise and unargumentable language of machine timestamps, exactly what Oracle had flagged and when, and exactly what the exercise reports had said Oracle had flagged and when, and the distance between those 2 things, which was not a small distance. But it was the last subfolder that made Pruitt stop typing. It was labeled with a date. The date was 4 days before Okafor died. Inside the subfolder were 3 email chains and 1 internal memorandum. The emails were between addresses that Nora did not immediately recognize. The memorandum bore a header from the program director's office. Pruitt read it once, then again. She sat back in the chair. The server room hummed. The fluorescent lights were very steady. "Well," Pruitt said, in a voice that had gone quiet, in the way that voices go quiet when something expected but still terrible arrives. "Now we know." Nora was already reading over her shoulder. The memorandum was brief. Its language was the language of programs and assets and operational considerations and risk mitigation. It discussed a specific internal complaint filed by a specific master sergeant. It assessed the complaint as a risk to program integrity. It outlined a recommended approach to resolution. The recommended approach was labeled in the careful, sanitized vocabulary of official documents. Subject removal from operational environment. Subject removal. The subject was Okafor. Nora read the signature block at the bottom of the memorandum. The name there was not Douglas Payne. The name there was Conrad Marsh, the general whose life she had protected this morning, the man she had pulled a trigger to save. She stood in the server room and held that knowledge the way you hold something unexpectedly heavy, the first second of understanding its actual weight. Then, from the doorway behind them, a voice. "How long have you had that file open?" They turned. Colonel Douglas Payne stood in the doorway of Building B3, alone. No MPs, no aide, no authorization document in his hand. Just the man himself, in the full light of the fluorescence, looking across the room at the screen where Ghost Zero had been open for the past 11 minutes. His face was not angry. It was not calculating. It was the face of a man who has reached the end of a very long road and is standing at the point where the road meets something that cannot be walked back from. He looked at the memorandum on the screen, at the name at the bottom of it. "I see you found the part I didn't write," he said. Nora looked at him. "Marsh has been running the documentation protocol for 8 months," Payne said. "I knew about the Oracle accuracy problem. I have known since month 4. I did not know that when Okafor filed his complaint, it was going to be routed to Marsh's desk." He paused. "I did not know what Marsh was going to do with it." The room held the weight of that. "But you knew afterward," Pruitt said. The silence that followed was its own answer. Payne walked into the room. He stopped at the edge of the workstation's light and looked at the server racks, and then at the 3 people in his field of view, and then at the screen again. "This morning," he said, "I pressed confirm environmental on your position because I needed Oracle to miss. I needed it to miss in front of witnesses, in a documented exercise, with evaluation team members present. If the system fails and someone reports the failure and I back that report instead of suppressing it, the entire data integrity question opens." He looked at Nora. "I needed the miss to come from the outside, from someone who could not be explained away." Nora said, "You needed someone stubborn enough to fire against a direct order. I needed someone who would see what Oracle didn't see and refuse to pretend otherwise." He held her gaze. "Okafor said there was one person on this post who fit that description. He told me that before he died. He told me, and then 3 weeks later, he was gone, and I had his name and his assessment, and no way to use either one without Marsh knowing I was using them." Nora thought about the small, private smile she had seen on Payne's face in the command vehicle, the smile of a man watching a chess piece move, the smile of someone who had been waiting for a specific thing to happen and had helped create the conditions for it without being able to control the outcome. She thought about what that cost: to wait, to allow, to stand at the edge of something terrible, because the alternative was allowing something more terrible to run forward unchecked. She thought about Okafor, who had made a different calculation with the same information and had not survived it. She thought about the words on the memorandum: subject removal. She looked at Payne. "Did you know they were going to kill him?" The fluorescent lights hummed. "No," Payne said. His voice was flat and certain, and carried in it the quality of a man telling the truth about the worst thing he knows about himself. "I knew Marsh would move to discredit him. I did not know how far he would take it. And when I understood what had happened, I had a choice. I could expose what I knew. I could go to the IG. I could file my own complaint. He stopped. Or I could build something that was harder to dismantle than a single complaint. Something that required the right person at the right moment to complete. Wakefield appeared in the doorway behind Payne, slightly out of breath. Phone in his right hand, screen lit, showing something he had been running toward with. He looked at the room, at Payne, standing inside it, at Nora's face. They're initiating a manual wipe of the main exercise server, Wakefield said. Someone just called it in from a secure terminal in the General's conference suite. He held up the phone. I have the timestamp. Nora looked at Dessen. Can they reach the B3 backup from the General's conference suite? No, Dessen said. That system is air-gapped, but they don't know that. Payne reached into his jacket and produced a phone. He dialed a number. It was answered on the second ring. He said, "This is Colonel Payne. I need 2 JAG officers and a CID agent at Building B3 immediately. Tell them to bring their credentials and their recorders." A pause. "Yes, now." He ended the call. He looked at the screen one more time, at the memorandum, at the name. Conrad Marsh has been running this program's documentation for 8 months, he said, to the room and to the screen, and perhaps to something further away than either of them. He ordered the suppression of Okafor's complaint. He authorized subject removal. A breath, long and controlled. And he has spent the last 14 months believing that because the file was closed and the man was gone, the matter was finished. He looked at Nora. "You are the reason it isn't finished," he said. "You and the man who knew you would be." The server room was quiet, except for the machines. The machines did not have opinions about what happened in the spaces between their racks. They stored what they were given, and they kept it until they were told to let it go. Ghost Zero blinked on the screen. Everything that came next was already in motion. Outside Building B3, somewhere across the motorpool lot, a vehicle was approaching, then another. The sound of authorization arriving, late and necessary, the way it so often did. Nora stood in the server room with Okafor's note still folded in her hand, and understood something that she had not had language for since the morning began. He had not left her a mission. He had left her a completion, something he had started and could not finish, and had trusted to the specific person who would refuse to look at the target and look instead at everything the target thought was safe. She had done that. She had done it the only way it could be done, by being exactly what she was. The door to B3 opened wider, and the sound of boots on concrete came in from outside, purposeful and increasing, and the last chapter of something Bernard Okafor had written with his life was about to begin. The JAG officers arrived first, 2 of them, both captains, carrying the expression of people who have been called to something faster than normal procedure allowed and are still assembling their understanding of what they have been called to. They came through the door of Building B3 with recorders already active, credentials already out, the institutional machinery of accountability that the Army had built for moments exactly like this one, designed to move once it was set in motion and difficult to stop. Behind them came the CID agent, a warrant officer named Briggs, mid-40s, with the deliberate economy of movement that comes from spending a career in rooms where evidence was fragile and first impressions permanent. He looked at the workstation, at the screen showing Ghost Zero, at the 5 people arranged in the server room around it, like a tableau that had been waiting for him to arrive. He looked at Payne last. "Sir," he said, "you made this call?" "I did," Payne said. "You're going to want to walk me through what we're looking at." Payne walked him through it. Methodical, complete. The voice of a man who has been preparing this statement, in one form or another, for 14 months. He named the program. He named the data integrity problem. He named the documentation protocol and who had been running it. He named the complaint, and the date it was filed, and the date it was closed, and the name of the master sergeant who had filed it. Briggs listened without interrupting. He was the kind of investigator who understood that the most important thing you can do in the first minutes of a complex situation is listen without shaping what you hear. He made notes in a small black notebook with the attention of someone for whom the act of writing was also the act of understanding. When Payne finished, Briggs looked at the memorandum still displayed on the screen. He read it. He read the signature block. "Brigadier General Conrad Marsh," he said. Not a question, a confirmation. "Yes," Payne said. Briggs wrote something in the notebook, closed it, looked at Nora. "You're the shooter from this morning's exercise." "Yes," Nora said. "You're currently under administrative hold." "I was. I left the hold location to reach this server before the backup was overwritten. CW3 Pruitt accompanied me." She did not apologize for this and did not explain it further. The facts were the facts. What they meant was a question for other people in other rooms. Briggs looked at her for a moment, recalibrating his understanding in real time. Then he looked at Wakefield, who was standing near the door with his phone still in his hand. "You have a timestamp on the manual wipe request?" Briggs asked. Wakefield handed him the phone. Briggs looked at the screen, wrote the timestamp in his notebook. "From the General's conference suite," Wakefield said. "I see that," Briggs said. He handed the phone back, turned to the JAG officers and spoke to them quietly for 30 seconds. They separated, one moving to the workstation to begin formally documenting the Ghost Zero contents, the other stepping into the doorway to make a call. Then Briggs walked to the door of Building B3 and stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at Nora. "Stay here," he said. "All of you. I need to find a general." Conrad Marsh was in his conference suite when they came for him. He was sitting at the head of the table with a cup of coffee and a printed copy of the exercise after action summary that one of his aides had prepared, and he was reading it with the careful attention of a man reviewing a document he intends to use. The summary was 6 pages. It reflected well on Oracle. It reflected poorly on Sergeant Nora Halsey, describing her actions as a failure of discipline and trust in system integrity. A soldier who had allowed personal bias to override institutional protocol. He had read 4 pages when the knock came. It was not the knock of an aide. It was the knock of authority, the measured, deliberate impact of a closed fist on a door from someone who has the rank to open it without knocking, and is knocking anyway because the form of the thing still matters to them. Marsh said, "Come in." Briggs came in. The 2 JAG captains came in behind him. One of them closed the door. Marsh looked at the 3 of them with the face of a man who has spent 32 years inside an institution and knows in the first 3 seconds of a situation what kind of situation it is. He had that kind of experience. He had learned to read rooms the way other people read faces. He read this one correctly. He set the after-action summary face down on the table. "I see," he said. Briggs placed his credentials on the table between them. "Sir, I am CID Special Agent Briggs. I am opening a formal investigation into the administration of the Oracle Field Evaluation Program and associated documentation practices. I need to ask you some questions." Marsh looked at the credentials, at the JAG officers on either side of the room, at the recorder that one of them was holding at chest height. "I want my JG counsel present," he said. "That is your right," Briggs said. "We can begin as soon as counsel arrives." Marsh looked at the face-down summary on the table, at the 4 pages he had read, at the coffee that was still hot. He said nothing else. The room waited. In Building B3, the server room had changed in character since the investigators arrived. What had been a space of urgency had become a space of procedure. The urgency was still there, but it had gone underground, into the careful work of the JAG officer at the workstation and the quiet conversation between Pruitt and Desson, and the stillness of Wakefield near the door, standing as he had stood on the ridge, present, observant, waiting for the next thing without trying to accelerate it. Nora stood apart from the others. She was at the far end of the server room, between two racks, where the sound of the machines was most present, that low collective hum of storage doing its constant work. She still had Okafor's note in her left hand. She had not put it down since Desson gave it to her. She was not reading it. She had read it. She was holding it because there was something in the physical fact of it that she was not ready to let go of yet. The note said a file name and a password. That was all. It did not say her name. It did not say anything that would make it legible to anyone who found it without the context she had been given. It was a key without a label on it, designed to be found only by the person who was already standing at the right door. He had known she would be. That was what she kept returning to, not the file, which was real and complete, and now in the hands of people who would use it correctly. Not the memorandum, which named Marsh and would end careers and possibly end a freedom. Not even the fact of Okafor's death, which had been a weight she had been carrying for 14 months and which now had a different shape, still heavy but no longer shapeless. What she kept returning to was the quality of the trust. He had not left this for the institution. He had not filed it through channels or deposited it with the Inspector General or placed it in the hands of someone with authority. He had left it in pieces, distributed across people and places, in a form that could only be assembled by the right sequence of events arrived at by the right person. He had left it for her, specifically, for someone who would refuse to look at the target, for someone patient enough to lie in the cold for 7 hours and see what everyone else had already decided wasn't there. He had trusted her with the completion of his work. She thought about what that meant, what it asked of her, what it had already asked of her this morning, and what it would continue to ask in the days and weeks ahead, when the investigations ground through their process, and the lawyers shaped their arguments, and the institution did what institutions do, which is to absorb difficult events and produce, eventually, some version of accountability that it can live with. She thought about being called to testify. She thought about standing in a room and saying what she had seen on that ridge, what she had felt in the interrogation room, what she had read on that screen. She thought about Okafor standing in a room somewhere and saying what he had found, and being heard not as a warning but as a problem. The difference between them, she understood, was not skill. It was not rank or experience or the quality of their evidence. The difference was that she was still here and he was not. That was the thing she could not resolve. The thing she would carry the way she had learned to carry other things, in the place where the body holds what the mind cannot settle. She unfolded the note one more time, read the 2 lines, folded it back. She tucked it into her jacket pocket alongside the scope, where it would be close to her chest, on the walk back, where Okafor had told her once, without knowing he was telling her, that the things worth keeping belong as close as possible. Payne found her there, in the space between the server racks, 20 minutes after Briggs left for Marsh's conference suite. He was not wearing his rank the same way he had worn it when he walked through the door of B3 earlier. Some authority, when the moment it was built for finally arrives, does not know what to do with itself in the aftermath. He looked like a man who had been running on a very specific purpose for a very long time, and the purpose had now been handed off, and the running had stopped, and what was left was just the man. He stopped a few feet from her. He did not try to occupy the space between them. He looked at the server racks, and then at the floor, and then at her. "This is not how I would have chosen to do this," he said. "I know," Nora said. "I want to be clear about something. What I did this morning, pressing that confirm button, letting the exercise run, that was not a decision I made lightly. I have thought about it for 6 months, about whether it was right, about whether there was another way. Was there? He was quiet for a moment. I have not found one that would have worked, he said. That is not the same as saying one didn't exist. She looked at him. He was 56 years old and had the face of a man who had asked himself hard questions about hard choices and had not always liked the answers. That was not nothing. She had known men who never asked. You used me, she said. Yes. You used the fact that I would do what Okafor knew I would do. You let me walk into something without telling me what it was. Yes, he said again. No qualification, no defense, just the word. She thought about what she wanted from that acknowledgement. She thought about whether it was enough. She thought about the fact that the result of everything that had happened since dawn was that Okafor's file was now in the hands of the CID. And Conrad Marsh was sitting in his conference suite with his coffee going cold and his after-action summary face down on the table, and Oracle's data integrity problem was going to be examined by people with the authority to examine it. And the memorandum with the words subject removal was part of a formal investigation record. She thought about what Okafor would have said about the question of whether the right outcome justified the way it was reached. She thought he would have said, "That is the question that never gets a clean answer. Ask it anyway. Ask it every time. Never stop asking it." "What happens to Oracle?" she said. Payne exhaled. "The program goes into review. The evaluation is suspended, pending investigation of the data integrity findings. That will take months, possibly longer." He paused. "The program itself is not finished. The technology is real, even if the reporting around it has been constructed. At some point, when the investigation is complete and the documentation methodology has been rebuilt from the ground up, it will go back into testing. With honest numbers. With honest numbers, he said. That is what Okafor wanted, not the end of the program, the truth about it. She had known that, reading the file, Okafor had not been opposed to Oracle. He had been opposed to the lie that surrounded it. He had understood, as a man who had spent 30 years learning to see clearly, that a system built on false data was not a system at all. It was a liability, a trap designed to look like a solution. The soldiers who would one day trust it in actual combat would trust it because the numbers said 97.2, and nobody had told them what that number actually measured. That was what he had been trying to stop, not the machine. The lie about the machine. She looked at Payne. "Are you going to be okay?" He looked slightly surprised by the question, and then something shifted in his face. The shift of someone receiving an unexpected grace in a difficult moment. "I am going to be held accountable for what I knew and when," he said. "As I should be. Beyond that, I don't know." Nora nodded. That was honest. That was about all you could ask a person to be. She turned back to the server racks and the hum of the machines, and for a moment, the room was simply what it was. A concrete building on a military installation in North Carolina, with fluorescent lights and the smell of recycled air and the sound of stored information keeping itself intact. A place where nothing looked like much of anything, and something had been kept safe for a long time. The investigation moved with the pace of institutional process, which is to say faster than the people inside it wanted, and slower than the people waiting on its edges needed. Marsh was placed on administrative leave, pending the formal CID inquiry, within 4 hours of Briggs's arrival. The announcement was brief and internal, the kind of language that says everything and explains nothing. Relieved of duties, pending review. His aide collected his personal items from the conference suite the following morning. The after-action summary he had been reading remained face down on the table, retrieved later as evidence, one document among several hundred. The Oracle evaluation was formally suspended 11 days after the exercise. The Pentagon announcement cited ongoing assessment of field performance data. The civilian contractor, who had walked alongside Marsh on the ridge, returned to his company and issued a statement through counsel expressing full cooperation with the investigation. The evaluation team members from Washington wrote reports of a different kind than they had been sent to write. Desson was placed under protective status as a cooperating witness. He continued to work in the B3 facility at a different workstation doing the same work, which was to keep data intact and tell the truth about what it contained. Pruitt submitted a formal intelligence assessment of the Oracle documentation methodology that ran to 41 pages and was classified at a level that meant most of the people it concerned would never read it. She submitted a separate 12-page summary to the IG's office that was not classified and eventually became the foundation of a congressional inquiry that nobody had been planning on. Wakefield had his report corrected in the official record. The original submission, with his actual words, was restored. The edited version was entered into evidence. Nobody ever identified with certainty who had made the changes, but the system access log pointed in a direction that investigators found consistent with their other findings. Nora was cleared of the insubordination charge 11 days after the exercise. On the same day, the Oracle evaluation was suspended. The clearance came in a one-paragraph letter on Army letterhead delivered to her unit mailbox. It stated that upon review of all available evidence, including witness statements, exercise footage, and signals intelligence data, her actions on Ridgeline Alpha on the date in question were found to be consistent with the duty of a soldier to protect the life of a senior officer when available systems had failed to provide adequate warning. She read the letter once, folded it, slid it into her jacket alongside Okafor's note, where both papers could be felt against her ribs when she breathed. She did not frame it. She did not share it. She did not feel, reading it, the thing that she had expected to feel, which was some version of relief or vindication or completion. She felt instead the quiet of a morning after something large has passed through. The kind of quiet that is not empty but full of everything that has moved and settled and changed and will not go back to what it was. 3 weeks after the exercise, on a Thursday morning in November, when the air at Fort Liberty had gone from the cold of October to something sharper and more final, Nora walked out to Ridgeline Alpha. Not for a mission, not for training. She walked out alone in the early morning, before the post fully woke, along the access road and up the eastern slope and across the traverse path to the northern edge, where the mountain laurel grew in the shallow depression between the two granite outcroppings. The frost was heavy that morning. It covered the ground evenly, including the base of the depression, including the soil beneath the laurel where 3 weeks ago the absence of frost had told her everything she needed to know. The frost was the same everywhere now. The evidence was gone, returned to the ordinary ground. She stood beside the bush for a while. She had brought nothing except herself and the morning and the weight of things she carried that could not be set down. She thought about Okafor standing somewhere and making a decision. Not the decision to build the file, or to give it to Pruitt, or to name Nora as the person who would complete it. An earlier decision than any of those. The decision made by a man who could see clearly and had spent his life teaching others to see the same way, to keep seeing even when seeing was dangerous, to keep reporting even when the reports were closed, to keep building a record even when the record was being erased. That decision was not dramatic. It did not happen in a moment of crisis. It happened over months, in the accumulation of small choices made by a man who understood that what he was doing might outlive him and was willing to do it anyway. She thought that was the bravest thing. Not the crisis, not the moment. The long, patient, unglamorous work of building something true in a space that kept insisting on something else. The mountain laurel moved in the wind, real wind this time, clean and steady from the northwest, moving every branch at the same rate. No anomaly in the pattern, nothing for a spotter to read except the ordinary fact of weather doing what weather does. She reached into her jacket pocket, took out the folded note, looked at it one more time in the cold morning light. The handwriting compact and precise, the two lines that were a file name and a password, and also something more than that. The record of a man who had trusted her with a completion. She folded it back, put it away. She turned and looked out from the top of the ridge. Fort Liberty spread below her in the early light, buildings and roads, and the geometry of military infrastructure, everything organized and purposeful and operating according to its design. The flag above the headquarters building was moving in the same northwest wind. The motor pool was coming alive, the first vehicles of the morning beginning their rounds. She thought about a letter she had found in her unit mailbox 4 days ago. Not the clearance letter, a different one, arrived separately, no return address, postmarked Washington. Inside, a single sheet of paper, no letterhead, no signature, just one typed line. Ghost 0, still open. She had read it 3 times. She had understood that it was not a threat. It was an answer to a question she had not known she was asking. The file that Okafor had built was complete, insofar as it addressed the events of the past 18 months. But the conditions that had made those events possible were older than Oracle and larger than one general's decisions, and not resolved by one investigation, however thorough. The machine could be fixed. The lie about the machine could be corrected. But the instinct that had produced the lie, the institutional desire to show what the numbers needed to show rather than what the evidence actually showed, that was not a problem that ended with an investigation. It was a problem that required the kind of ongoing, patient, unglamorous attention that Okafor had practiced every day for 30 years. The kind of attention she had been trained to provide. She had not responded to the letter. She had not decided yet what to do with it. She was still in the stage of carrying it, the way you carry a new weight before your body has learned to distribute it correctly. She would carry it until she knew. Below her, the flag snapped once in a gust and then settled back to its steady movement. The motor pool vehicles were spreading out across the post in their morning patterns. The day was beginning in all its ordinary complexity, without announcement, without waiting. She took one breath of the cold morning air. Let it go. She picked up the M110 case from the ground beside her boot, where she had set it without thinking, because some habits run deeper than thought, and she began to walk back down the ridge. She did not look back at the depression. She did not need to. She had already seen everything it had to show her on a different morning, in a different light. When the frost was absent in one small line, and the branch was moving against the wind, and everyone with a screen in front of them had already decided that the ground was safe. She had seen it. She had refused to pretend she hadn't. That was what Okafor had taught her, not how to shoot. She had known that already. He had taught her what shooting was for, when you stripped away the mechanics and the discipline and the long, cold hours of preparation. It was for the moment when everything the system trusted had already been decided, and one person had to be willing to stand in the gap between what the machine said and what was actually true. She had stood there. She walked down the slope in the cold November morning, carrying the rifle and carrying the note and carrying the question that the letter had left open, and she thought about the fact that Bernard Okafor had known when he built the file and distributed the pieces and named the person who would assemble them, that the work did not end with assembly. He had not left her a conclusion. He had left her a continuation. She reached the bottom of the slope and turned onto the access road and walked toward the post without hurrying, at the pace of someone who knows where she is going and has calculated the distance correctly. 3 months later, she received orders. She was in the unit bay when they arrived, folded in a plain envelope that the mail clerk handed her with the neutrality of someone who has no idea what they are delivering. She opened it there, standing, not taking it to a desk or a private space. She read it. The orders were single-page. They listed a reporting location and a date and a unit designation and a clearance level that was higher than her current one. They did not describe a role or a mission or what she would be doing when she got there. They listed a contact name in Washington and a phone number and the instruction to call upon receipt. She read the clearance level again. She folded the orders and placed them in her jacket alongside everything else she was carrying from that morning. Okafor's note, the clearance letter, the letter from Washington with no return address. She thought about the line that had arrived from Washington. Ghost 0, still open. She walked to the window of the unit bay. Outside, the November sky over Fort Liberty was the color of old iron, the same gray as the morning of the exercise, the morning everything had begun. The flag above the headquarters building moved in the wind. The ground was hard with frost. She stood at the window and said nothing, and her face was still in the way that it was always still when she had already made her decision and was simply waiting for the moment to move. The phone call was going to be made. The orders were going to be followed. The work was going to continue. Wakefield appeared in the doorway of the unit bay behind her. He had an envelope of his own, the same plain kind, and he was looking at it with the expression of someone who has just read something unexpected and is still in the first seconds of understanding what it asks. He looked up and found her at the window. She looked at the envelope in his hand, at his face. He said nothing. He did not need to. She turned back to the window and the cold November sky and the flag and the frost on the ground. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the perimeter road, beyond the tree line, beyond the ridge where the mountain laurel grew in a shallow depression between two granite outcroppings, the day continued its ordinary business of being the day, indifferent and relentless and full of everything that had not yet been seen.